It's time to finish off Real Robot once and for all. I hate these terms. It's a dumb pair of terms. For the same reason that biology broke mecha as a definition for so long, there's just basically way too many loopholes. You ask about a show, and what does it mean, and will you like that show, and what do you get? Well, you see, Macross is a real robot show because even though it's a universe where pop music saves the day, and fighter jets transform into not one, not two, but three different forms. Don't worry, this is a realistic setting, because the machines sometimes look like a mass-produced machines. And also, holy shit, that man's head is actually just broccoli. Then you look at Evangelion, and it's like, of course it's a super robot. Like, look, Super Robot Wars says so. Don't worry about the thing being mass-produced. You know, Super Robot Wars, it's the definitive friggin' Bible of authority on mecha. I mean, naturally, every mecha show ever made was probably considering its future placement in this kind of bad turn-based RPG thing that mainly gets by on nice sprite work, being able to mishmash a bunch of popular series in spite of having boring, repetitive gameplay. Yeah, this is for sure the go-to for understanding these stories. I see no problems with this whatsoever. Now it's time to rewind a bit and explain kind of how we got here. Basically, mecha had existed for a while. Tetsujin 28 Go and Astro Boy were obviously big players very early on in the 60s. The following period saw shows like Mazinger and Getter come out in the 1970s. This is the period we now addressed as basically giving rise to the trends that we now define as Super Robot. Now I also dislike Super Robot, but it's slightly more useful. However, I'm going to basically say there is a better way of classifying and dealing with these stories than trying to juggle the nightmare of stupid questions like, are Getter Rays realistic? Or, you know, is Mazinkaiser stronger than Getter Emperor? My power level is bigger than the other power level. Basically what happened was a little show came along, and that show was something big happened here. Something significant. Something that has been building for a long time. Yoshiaki Tamino wanted to do what maybe inevitably happens in many genres, and especially in SF. Tamino had been putting together in his earlier work this kind of sense of more mature ideas or more consequential storytelling. Zambot 3 has a wonderfully fun Human Bomb episode that kind of highlights the build up to this. He wanted to push anime, but specifically mecha, to a new point. A point where we had a show that was kind of something more significant in terms of its setting. More than just a black and white evil scientists and space aliens and they're trying to invade, something more grounded in its conflict, a sort of world war. But here's why the definition of real robot is insisted to have emerged. Real robot. Now this definition and its relationship to mecha and war are very important, mainly because it's shit. I'll be covering war in depth later on, but I want to really focus in this video on killing real robot once and for all. See, the argument normally put forward is that real robots are more realistic, and you know, they're used like normal machines, and they're limited by ammunition and fuel, you know, they're less spectacular and so on. But as I kind of mentioned in the first video, this definition is kind of shit because so many supposedly real robots break their own rules, and plenty of supposedly super robots also manage to obey these same rules as well. Trying to make an argument off of technology for this reason is dumb for exactly this. For example, Gunbuster is clearly a very superpowered machine, yet it has a mass-produced version, and the series has science lessons after every episode to really try and sell you it as this kind of build-up and grounded thing. But is this a real robot or a super robot? The Gundam itself is made with a magic metal alloy, not unlike Mazinger before it, and even Tamino himself really doubted its realistic ability to be used on Earth as a weapon of war. And also look at Dougram. Dougram is fucking fantastic. The political feel was, you know, very depressingly realistic, the conflict is fantastically fleshed out, but most of the battles involve a giant colorful robot jumping around and shooting at each other. Don't get me wrong, it's better justified, probably even more than Gundam, but I don't feel like squishing the series into real or super actually does much to describe it or really complement it. So what's going on here? Why does this matter to mecha? Why is this shift from a robot piloted by a person fighting a big weird dinosaur to a robot piloted by a person fighting another robot also piloted by a person such a big fucking deal? Well, it's time to answer that question, and it's time to talk about the big one. Yeah, that's right, this is the big war, the most powerful war. It's claimed millions of hours of effort. It's claimed blood and tears. It's a conflict so terrible, it's gone on for decades, and you probably never even considered it. It's been so horrible that the battles being waged were being waged long before you're ever likely born. That's right, of course I'm talking about, what's the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars? No, seriously, it's actually more or less the same problem as real and super. Nerds, specifically engineering nerds, will pop up and say, well actually, Star Trek is based on science. Except, not really. It might have been a long time ago, but then they actually had to make the show, and a shuttle prop wasn't finished, and they decided to just fucking special effects people down to the planet set. The same argument from technology made by these nerds basically also breaks for the same reasons as Real vs. Super. Like sure, Star Trek puts up a more convincing disguise, but it ultimately did what most of science fiction does. It got its technobabble and machines to a point where the characters and story and plot could get where they needed to. In that aspect, Star Wars is more or less the same. Lucas started off with the same idea that more realistic ships equals more gooder space story, but then he just sort of melted it down until the machines could take the characters and story where they needed to go. But we still feel the difference, right? We still know that, watching a grunt soldier in a Zaku violently die in an explosion feels pretty different from seeing a dinosaur monster also do the same thing. We know that Star Wars makes us feel and think and enjoy its wars and conflicts very differently from Star Trek. So we get back to the same issue. What's really going on here? See, now, I love machines, and it's easy to get distracted by them, and nerds really like to use them to argue, but if we zoom in real close, keep going, a little more, there we go. Heroic adventure and legendary storytelling versus conceptual story and idea-based storytelling. Yep, that's it. Sorry, Carrie, Star Wars is not actually about family, it's about a big fun space adventure. Lucas even pulled from Joseph Campbell's monomyth the granddaddy template for heroic adventures and legends. Star Trek, in comparison, was initially very heavily tied into Gene Roddenberry's utopian vision. It's a series of stories about morality, society, race, and the problems of racism, and how to solve these problems trying to use diplomacy or understanding. Even with Roddenberry's kind of sterile influence fading off towards many of the later Star Trek series, this was basically still the rough conceptual focus, and really a focus of presenting and dealing with these ideas. This is basically identical to the understanding of Gundam. What changed with Gundam was not merely some kind of technological approach to its robots, it was the concept of Gundam's ideas. It was Tomino wanting to make a show where the arc of the story wasn't just Amuro facing off on a week-by-week villain basis, but rather it was a group of people dealing with a bigger war. This is something, of course, other shows were dealing with and many dealt with afterwards, but Gundam is the focal turning point here for this, and it really focused in on it in a big way. Now this is where I kind of have to admit I tricked you a bit. The whole Star Trek versus Star Wars thing, and even the whole dichotomy of Real versus Super, don't have a successor dichotomy. Conceptual stories can use adventures to tell their ideas, and adventure stories can certainly touch on concepts to enhance their action and plot. What I'm basically saying is I don't mean these two approaches to dealing with things are absolute. I don't want to give the impression of a new paradigm of, Category A and Category B type shows. I will get into wars and their relationship to mecha in another video, but a big point I want to touch on right now is that, in essence, even though real robots try to sell themselves as more grounded, there's still kind of a romanticization of war in a way. But I don't mean that means it discredits it. Just because a super and real as definitions are restrictive and kind of shit and can be broken down, doesn't mean that Gundam and the shows after it, even those with experimenting with it beforehand, did not revolutionize mecha and anime's approach to dealing with these bigger concepts. Just because a machine is 18 meters tall and bright white and blue, doesn't mean that it's not a story submerged in dealing with, violence, hate, deep personal issues. And likewise, just because it's dark gray and blue and can jump into the air by 30 meters doesn't mean that it's, not saying something about maybe colonialism or guerrilla conflicts. I really want to hammer this home. Just because your gritty story has fantastical elements does not mean it's disqualified for being too super, and from dealing with heavier concepts as well. Super robot shows do have a sort of set pattern for a specific period, but the thing that truly binds them together is their heroic orientation towards conflict, about defeating the monstrous enemy by struggling against them. But there are still some exceptions, and Tomino was not alone in wanting to move forwards towards something heftier. Likewise, during the 80s, which is supposedly the boom period for these real robot shows that took after Gundam, we see more or less the same problem. Many of these shows focus on a more heroic orientation towards their story. Giant Gorg or Rayarth, they're really more about the adventure and they're not really about any significant heftier concepts or ideas. So really the technology argument falls apart constantly, but then so too as well, it's important to understand that these trends are not as rock solid as they appear. Experimentation happens, and it happens quite a lot. This is kind of my key point. The old categorization dichotomy was dumb and broken and developed to help Super Robot War devs basically find out how to fucking make a game or balance out of these, various mecha shows. My other suspicion is that this was a definition made up by competitive nerds to feel better for being on one side or the other of an imaginary axis of their tastes and shows. So what I'm basically saying is there is no good, strict dichotomy for understanding these works. I'm saying there's a wide fucking spectrum of what mecha's conflicts are, and what their focus is, and if they're dealing with these big concepts, or if they're just trying to tell a fun adventure. Fantastical elements in grounded shows, and grounded elements in fantastical shows are not some magic delineator for understanding mecha stories, or for categorizing them for that matter. And the same applies to a lot of science fiction. It's just another factor that can be focused many ways to zoom in on one point in an adventure, or another point in an ideological concept. It's just like characters or themes, or plot, and so on, and that it's just a thing that serves the greater story.